Is this thing on? Oh, yeah. All right. Delicious. Pamplemousse. Welcome to episode 1 of the Luke Marchesani show on culture, aesthetics, philosophy, and design, with the intention of unlocking the genius within you-manity, as a pun, you and humanity. What else to discuss in the first episode, of course, other than the exceptional novel that I have here, Anna Karenina, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Forgive me, Tolstoy, if I'm not. He may be rolling over in his grave. That being said, I just finished reading it. It's a 817-page novel, 8 parts, written in 1878, officially published in 1878 by, of course, Leo Tolstoy. It's widely considered, I believe, one of the greatest novels of all time, and I can see why. It is a true masterpiece. I read it not really knowing what I was getting myself into, and obviously 150 years later, it's still speaking of the human experience, of small social interactions and customs that we're all aware of, but that aren't happening yet. At the same time, large kind of global existential crises that individuals and even countries face. Obviously, it's set in Russia, in a similar time period to when Tolstoy was alive, and there's 2 main characters. Okay, and I thought about how are we going to analyze this, right? Because it's a massive book, it's a masterpiece, and I intentionally did not really read a lot of external pieces about the book itself. I wanted to kind of have a pure, unadulterated view of it, right? Just to read it, experience it for myself, interpret it through the natural lenses that I have coming to it from my various experiences and education. And I'm not the most educated, but I think I have a decent grasp on the story. I wrote my undergrad thesis on the story, and themes and the human experience. These are things that I think about often, and so that's why I feel like this is a perfect first episode. And so I'm really just going to interpret it as I see fit. And the question is really, what would be an ultimate end, right? What would be a good goal of this process, right? Of this video? And I don't really know. I think it's like, I'm definitely going to give spoilers. But I think it's like to say, what can we learn from the text? What is Tolstoy really getting at? How does it affect us, in our current culture? And what are these things at the core, right? At the crux of the message of the novel itself. And so I figure there's multiple ways that we could, tackle this thing, right? We could tackle it in terms of plot, structure. We could take kind of the linear narrative storyline and say, okay, this is what happened, then this is what happened, then this is what happened. We could look at it through characters, because there's several characters, which I love that, because he has so much time to develop it. He can focus in on various characters at various times. The 2 main characters, not obviously, but one being Anna Karenina, and the second being Levin. I don't know if I'm saying that right either, but work with me, right? So we could look at it through characters, we could look at it through themes, we could even look at it kind of through, some of the quotes, the big ideas that really stuck out to me, and of course, other ideas would stick out to other people. And what I've decided is kind of to take a hodgepodge of all of it, right? And understand how the plot, the characters, and the themes, the big ideas all interrelate to become this masterpiece and become something that, you know, has this form to it that's like, it's like this heart that's beating, and then you kind of, everything comes to life at the end, right? The blood flows through the entire body, and then everything that you saw throughout is like moving and alive in its own way, with its own meaning, with its own kind of, you know, that certain coordination that a body has, right? I haven't thought of that metaphor until now, but I kind of like it as we're stumbling upon it. And so, like I said, pure analysis, trying not to read other works about it because I want to just give my thoughts on it. And hopefully they resonate with you. So this is the idea, is what can we learn from this incredible piece? And so one of the things that, to kind of begin, that struck me was the reality of theology and Christian doctrine baked into the story, right? For some reason, I just did not expect that. But obviously with Russian Orthodoxy and kind of this cultural Russian Orthodoxy Christianity being baked into their experience as Russians in that time period, it's indelibly baked into and experienced in the work, so much so that the very first words are a quote of scripture where it says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And I believe it's quoting somewhere in Deuteronomy. It's quoting God himself, right? And then the very next line, the first line actually written by Tolstoy, not a quote, is extremely famous. I first read it in Joseph Campbell's work, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he uses it to describe his theory of story and narrative and myth. And we've probably maybe heard this quote or heard allusions to it. And it's simple and defiant, yet extremely profound, right? And it says, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And so it's a family novel, right? The piece that I did read about it was the introduction to my translation, right? I read the introduction, lots of really interesting kind of preface to the book itself. Obviously, there's some spoilers. I think those of us who are familiar with the work know how it ends for the main character, Anna, or Anna, I believe it's pronounced. So yes, there will be some spoilers throughout, but after he shares this kind of grand thesis, right, of the almost the whole book, but it's more than just about family. It's about so many other themes. It's about meaning. It's about purpose. It's about death. It's about life. It's about God. It's about work. It's about idleness. It's about politics and culture and farming and socio-political and economic pressures and dynamics, right? And so he's tackling a lot of things in these 817 pages, but the next sentence after this famous kind of thesis describes an unhappy family. It goes on to say, "All was confusion in the Oblonsky's house." Okay, so now let's get into the story a little bit. Let's get into the narrative a little bit. Showing, right, that the Oblonskys are probably one of these unhappy families that is unhappy in its own way. And what's going on is Oblonsky, who is also known as Stepan Arkadyevich, hopefully I say that right, or Arkadyic, I'm not sure. He is, he's this happy-go-lucky, kind of larger-than-life. You know, if I was going to give him a type on the Enneagram, he'd probably be a type 7. He's got energy, vivaciousness, charm. He kind of rouses people and brings them in and galvanizes them around himself and around kind of just the funness of life, right? Around food, around kind of partying, around, in some ways, around idleness. And the story really starts by focusing right in on Oblonsky. And what's happened is Oblonsky has had an affair, and maybe throughout the book you might think maybe multiple affairs, with, I guess, or against, or while in relationship with his wife, whose name is Dolly for sure. That's her nickname. And Dolly is extremely upset, and the only way to bring peace between the two characters, Dolly and Oblonsky, her husband, or Stepan, is for Stepan's sister, Anna Karenina, to come and talk to Dolly and try to convince her to reconcile with Oblonsky. And so it beautifully kind of shows how both Dolly and Stepan are going about their lives, and the things that they do on a daily basis that give them a sense of importance help them escape from the pain of the adultery. And for Dolly, it's being a mom. It's caring for, I think she has 5 kids. For Stepan, it's this incredible introduction to him working as sort of a governmental bureaucrat, like a public service role, but the role making a lot of money, but seems like he's not really actually doing a lot. But he has this, grandiose personality. Everyone looks up to him. He's charming. He's, kind of like the mayor type, like shaking hands, kissing babies, but sort of with this magnetic pull to be used for his own advantage, at least as it might play out throughout the rest of the story. And so you're focused on these two characters, and then the two main characters kind of join into that story, and those being Anna and Levin, right? And so Anna is sort of a figment of Tolstoy's imagination, from my understanding, but also based off of a story of a woman near his estate. And Tolstoy's obviously Russian. He himself was sort of a nobleman, but wanted to live like the peasants, but lived on this massive estate. And Levin is basically an autobiographical character of Tolstoy himself. Okay, so you have these kind of two archetypes, essentially. And if we get into the characters a little bit more, the archetypes, Anna is married into an extremely wealthy, powerful, another kind of public servant, government post-holding aristocrat in the high society of St. Petersburg. Oblonsky, Dolly, and a lot of the other characters live in Moscow. Okay, and so Anna comes to visit from St. Petersburg, and she has everything that you'd think a person would want. Her husband is extremely wealthy. She has, all of the means. She's extremely charming, extremely good looking, extremely kind of charismatic and convincing. And she has a son who is like loves her, and she loves him deeply. Yet there's still something gnawing at her on the inside. Like it's still not enough, right? And Levin lives in the country. And so this is kind of another dichotomy here of the city versus the country, right? And so Levin kind of represents this character who he owns an estate, but he's a farmer. He's kind of dedicated to his craft. He oversees the musics. Again, if I'm saying that wrong, please don't be upset. But the musics are kind of these characters that maybe used to be serfs and now are kind of these simple peasants, right? And all throughout the story, the musics are kind of, there's this veneration, this romanticization of the musics. Every time they're speaking or highlighted, they live this simple life. They live this beautiful life. They live sort of, they're peasants. Everything is kind of just, they're outside working with their hands. They're always singing, they're dancing, they're happy, right? And it's so contrasted to the life of the city folk, the rich, idle noblemen and aristocrats who really all they do is hold these government posts that they didn't really earn, that make them a ton of money, that aren't actually helping society that much. And they hold lavish dinners and balls, right? And they're kind of just soaking in idleness, right? And they're not actually living a life of hard work and meaning. And so you have this kind of dichotomy. And even when Levin comes to Moscow, to the city, to try to court another main character named Kitty, I think multiple people kind of ask him about the Muziks and what they're like, and almost in a derogatory way, like almost like, do you even associate with them? Like, what are they like, kind of thing. And so there's this, from Tolstoy, he kind of has this veneration, this glorification of them, but from the people in the city, it's almost like they're this other entity that you shouldn't even touch or interact with. And Levin almost acts as this middleman, right? One of the things I want to talk about is the hermeneutics of three, is kind of a phrase that I've thought of lately, that oftentimes we have, if you think of Hegel, right, you have the dialectic, you have one kind of option on one end of the spectrum, and then the opposite, right? But then Hegel's kind of dialectic is meant to have this synthesis in the middle. That's sort of the combination of the truths of both into what becomes a more idealized idea or theory, right? And so I think you have the high society men and women from the city, and then you have the Muziks, which are the peasants, but then you have Levin as the third, the hermeneutics of three. He's kind of that middle way, to steal a Buddhist idea. Not too tight, not too loose, right in that perfectly tuned zone that allows him to kind of understand both sides and find the truth within all of it. And so, obviously, Levin is based off of Tolstoy himself, and there's several similarities that you'll see between them, between their lives, between their passions, between their struggles. So, all of that to say, let's take a quick sip of my LaCroix that this episode is sponsored by. Just kidding, but one day, LaCroix, you will be sponsoring this. I'm going to clip this. All right. So let's continue on. Anna is the only one that can help salvage Oblonsky and Dolly's marriage. And so she comes to Dolly. She convinces her. She uses all of her charm, her charisma, her wit, her salesmanship to convince her to reconcile with her husband, her husband is Oblonsky, and Oblonsky is Anna's brother, right? So you can see some of the similarities between Anna and Oblonsky's personalities with this kind of larger than life self-awareness of, how people can't really resist me, right? And so she uses this to help her brother. But on this trip, she also encounters another situation where she uses all of her tact, her charm, her charisma for her own advantage. And perhaps even fixing Oblonsky's marriage is using it for her own advantage of self-aggrandizement. But I digress. She sees a guy by the name of Vronsky, Count Vronsky, okay? And Vronsky ends up becoming one of the main characters as well. And so Vronsky, when Anna meets him, is courting a girl by the name of Kitty. Okay. And Kitty, as I mentioned earlier, is also being courted by Levin. They're kind of battling it out. And Kitty's father thinks that Kitty should choose Levin. Kitty's mother thinks that Kitty should choose Vronsky. Vronsky is playing a game. He's doing all the things that he thinks he should be doing, but not knowing that he's actually playing with Kitty's heart. And in the process of both the men courting Kitty, Kitty chooses Vronsky. But then that evening, pretty much, they go to a ball, and Kitty wants to dance with Vronsky, but Vronsky becomes ensnared by Anna, Karenina. She essentially seduces him, right? Not sexually, but with her charm, with her beauty, with her kind of strange aloofness, this desirability that she has. And you can tell she wants to seduce him, right? She wants him to like her. I think we all experience that, or at least I do, that feeling of wanting to prove almost to myself that someone, especially someone maybe wealthy or good looking or intelligent, could like me, that I would have the ability to get that person to like me. And she uses all of her skills, so to speak, to accomplish that end. And in so doing, eventually and essentially, she causes Vronsky and Kitty to not be together anymore. And it causes Kitty to have a broken heart, right? And even more, she's beating herself up that she chose Vronsky, this kind of bad dude, essentially, this kind of just selfish, charming young guy who can kind of thinks he can do whatever he wants and everything goes his way. She chooses him over Levin, who's this kind of earnest, almost awkward, but hardworking, and in his own right, very successful man who's not just necessarily skated by on his father's success, but he's continued what has been passed on to him and built something beautiful in his farm and in his estate. And so Kitty's left with a broken heart. Oblonsky and Dolly are reconciled, and Anna and Vronsky have eyes for each other, okay? And there's so much more that we could go into. That probably is maybe part 1, and there's 8 parts, okay? But I'm not really going to go through much more of the storyline because it's extremely long. What I want to go through now is kind of how does the story interact with these themes, right? And what are the repeated motifs, some of the foreshadowing, some of the quotes, some of the ideas that, like I said, build out this kind of beating heart and body of this novel. And then how does it all come back? Maybe at the end we try to say what is at the heart of the novel, of the work, of the masterpiece itself. And so what I want to touch on is Levin. While Kitty has a broken heart, Levin is lonely. And Levin goes back to his life, and essentially his closest friend, or the person he can talk to the most on a continual basis, is essentially his housekeeper, who's known him for years. She's old, but she's faithful and loyal. And Levin is on this track of trying to write a book that will essentially revolutionize the theory of farming in Russia, but then around the world, right? He has this kind of grandiose vision. And he thinks, I think in some ways he thinks that that thing, that task, that accomplishment will make him worthwhile. But his housekeeper, who listens to his philosophizing and knits while he talks, I think, she says, I think you need to get married. She doesn't think that he needs to go and write this transcendent book. She thinks he needs to get married. And he kind of knows it, but he doesn't really want to admit it. So Levin is lonely. At the same time, while Levin is lonely, Kitty is heartbroken. And what they do is they send her abroad. I think maybe Italy or Germany or something. Not super important. she goes abroad to try to fix her broken heart, and she meets this beautiful character named Varenka. She's perhaps one of the stars in terms of morality, purity, kind of this idyllic character. She's beautiful in her own way, but unassuming. And essentially what she does is she just is serving everyone that is at this kind of hospital thing that's abroad, right? It's more like a hotel with sick people, and she's serving everybody. She's so earnest, she's so kind, and Kitty essentially falls in love in a platonic way with Varenka. And Varenka and her say that Varenka will come visit Kitty when she gets married, if she gets married. And Varenka comes back into the story a little bit later, so I don't want to forget about her. But around this time, the tension is building between Anna and Vronsky, right? Count Vronsky and Anna end up, through a series of cat and mouse, end up, consummating in some ways their adultery, right? And in the moment, Anna is full of shame, right? And this shame, I think, becomes one of the main driving forces of her experience throughout the rest of the novel, and her kind of self-loathsomeness that kind of takes over almost her entire being. And in this time, Vronsky's life is starting to go and get worse and worse. Vronsky was used to everything going well for him. He was, he had a massive inheritance. He was charming. He was successful in the military as much as he could be, even though he often chose not to take these kind of aspiring pathways towards greatness. He raced horses. He was always successful. But the moment that happens, that's very clear, is Vronsky loses a race at the very end of this horse race. And it kind of shakes him up. It kind of awakens him to this reality that life can be difficult, right? And so his life is getting worse as he's in this, has a liaison with Anna. Anna's life is getting worse. She's getting more ashamed. She's hating more and more her husband, who is a very interesting character altogether, but not really one that we have enough time to cover right now. And so that's kind of the scenario going on. Levin's lonely. Kitty has a broken heart. Anna and Vronsky are, having an affair. It's still sort of secret, but it's beginning to destroy their lives. And essentially, Tolstoy spends a lot of time, like I said, going on kind of micro pathways, discussing different characters, their histories, why they came to be the way that they are. But as time goes on, you see Levin kind of having this realization of like, he basically is he's in his farm, he's experiencing the farming life, he's seeing the musics, and he's so enthralled by their life that he says, you know what, I'm gonna live this simple life. I'm going to be as good at farming as I possibly can be. I'm going to try to enjoy everything that I have. And then right after he decides that, he sees Kitty in a carriage coming by him in basically kind of by his country estate, and she's traveling to visit her sister. And it completely flips this massive realization that he's had, and he's like, no, I'm going to have a family, right? I want to get married. And he eventually ends up pursuing Kitty again, courting her. They get married. They have a baby, right? And so the irony is that, so as I was saying, Anna's sin really becomes the gateway for Kitty to experience the life that she wanted, It brings her away from Vronsky, who is bad news, and brings her eventually into, the arms and the marriage with Levin. And so as all of this is happening, again, Anna has confessed to her husband that she's having an affair, and she leaves, right? She goes abroad as well, I think this time to Italy, with Vronsky, and they're trying to live this life of kind of diversion, right? They're trying to visit artists, and they're trying to, kind of just fix up like this house. Like they're just trying to basically run away from the fact that Anna's still married, that neither of them are actually really happy, but they're just trying to distract themselves from the reality. And they end up coming back to Russia, and Anna is essentially cast out of society, right? And so she can't really go out. She can't have relations. She wants to get divorced, but her husband won't divorce her. And so she ends up getting more and more and more and more trapped. And the quote that I really want to read that I think sums up almost her whole existence is this. This is in part 7, I believe. She says, "Do I live? I don't live. I wait for a denouement that keeps being postponed. Again, there's no answer. And Stiva, he can't go." Stiva is Oblonsky. "He can't go to Alexei Alexandrovich," who is her husband. "And I can't write again. I can't do anything, start anything, change anything. I restrain myself, wait, invent amusements for myself. The Englishman's family, writing, reading, but it's all only a deception, the same morphine again." And so she's essentially reached this state of hopelessness, right? Everything she's tried is just another diversion, another deception, another morphine, another kind of substance meant to distract her and make her feel better temporarily. But she's stuck. She's trapped. She can't do anything. She can't get a divorce. She can't go out. She can't be seen in society. And so she's trying to do all these things just to make her feel better. And isn't that the experience we have, right? So much of what we're doing is just this vain attempt to make ourselves feel better and kind of numb ourselves from this experience of life that we're having. Now, granted, we're not all in the same experience that she is, but that quote just stuck out to me, of this feeling of being stuck, of being trapped, and so much of it is her own doing, right? She chose to use her charm. Granted, her husband is very difficult, right? They have very little in common. There's no spark there. But she chose the path for herself. She chose to create an unhappy family, right? That's the thesis, one of the main themes. And her unhappy family is unhappy in a different way than, say, Oblonsky and Dolly, right? But you have the happy family forming between Levin and Kitty. Kitty is kind. They at least share, right, their difficulties. They share their what would be the word? Kind of their offenses with the other. They're fairly honest, right, between Kitty and Levin, and they have a child. But the child is not quite the experience that you would think that it would be, right? Because Levin is searching for meaning. He's searching for purpose. Like the question that keeps coming up to him at the end of the novel is, what am I? Why am I here? Right? And when he has the child, the son, he actually he doesn't feel this sense of joy. He feels this sense of pity for his son. And it bothers him, right? Because he was hoping that he would feel something different, something better. And so the biblical idea, right, of what is our purpose in life, and what a lot of, I think, thinkers like your Jordan Petersons or even your John Vervaeke's John Vervaeke is not a Christian, but he would say that taking on the responsibility, especially as a man, of having a family, caring for your wife, caring for your children, that filial relationship between father and child represents, he would say, whether or not he believes it, this relationship that humans have to God, right? The creator and the created. And it's this, inexpressible joy and love that's so deep and so profound. But Levin is not really experiencing this. And, even in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, one of the first chapters, God kind of creates everything and then gives this mandate. He says, be fruitful and multiply, right? Fill the earth and subdue it. So he's saying, get married, have kids, right? Expand, build, go. And Levin's doing all of this, but he still, just like Anna, has this deep sense of doubt, this deep sense of emptiness, and this nagging hole, this existential struggle for who he is, what he is, why he is. But he takes that in a direction that is much more prosperous and fruitful than Anna. Let's take Anna's end, right? She takes her direction. She goes with adultery. She becomes an outcast. She becomes trapped. She becomes addicted to morphine to stop her from thinking about how horrible her life is. And just as is foreshadowed in the very beginning of the novel, where someone commits suicide by stepping in front of a train, Anna gets to the end and commits suicide. She steps in front of a train. And it's horribly sad, and your heart is pounding reading it. But Tolstoy paints it in such a way that it's almost honorable. You can see that Anna has gone out of her mind, that literally she's been possessed by an evil spirit. This is a phrase and a concept that Tolstoy uses from the very beginning when she seduces Vronsky, that she has this side of her that's possessed by evil, and that evil corrupts her, and she's literally losing her mind. She's literally having conversations with the world around her in ways that are full of anger, full of hate, full of deception, lies, seeing the world in a way that's not actually all the way how it is, but in some ways it is how she's created it to be with her decisions and the decisions of somewhat those people around her. And this insanity literally drives her to end her life. And this idea of death is so prominent. It's such a massive theme. And I think Tolstoy wrote another work called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, if I'm saying that right. Death is such a prominent theme for Tolstoy. So much so that the only chapter that has a name, the rest of the chapters are just numbers, Roman numerals. The only chapter that has a name is called Death. And this chapter really summarizes, for Levin, the deep darkness and pain and kind of overwhelming feeling of death when his brother dies. And Levin kind of equated the birth of his child almost in the opposite sense to the death of his brother. The experiences were very similar. The birth obviously being crossing from non-existence to existence, death being crossing from existence to non-existence. But he's grappling with this moment where the eternal meets the present and the real, right? And you realize that there's something bigger going on, whatever it is, whoever it is, wherever it is. And Levin is grappling with this, and this idea of death is such a theme. Obviously, the end for Anna being she commits suicide. And you'd think that after she commits suicide, it would paint Levin as discovering this kind of opposite, right? This joy of life. But after she commits suicide, at the very end of part 7, there's still one more part. And Tolstoy just brilliantly brings you into this other world, but then pulls Levin in. And it's this masterful kind of philosophical debate going on within Levin's head. He's suffering deeply, and Kitty, his wife, can tell, but she can't really help him. He's suffering deeply, trying to figure out those questions I said. What am I? Why am I here? And he's looking at just things happening on a daily basis. You know, his the musics who work for him, cultivating crops, and the horses eating whatever they eat. And he's looking at these things and he's thinking, what is the point? It's all going to end. These workers are going to die. This horse is going to die. I'm going to die. And then he ends up having this conversation with the music, who tells him about 2 different people. One is this wealthy, selfish landowner who basically is trying to just take advantage of everyone and live for his belly, live for himself. And then this other music who lives for the soul, who lives for God. And Levin hears this phrase, and it awakens him. It connects all the threads of everything he'd been questioning. And it's something beyond the material, right? Because he's reading the materialists, he's reading these philosophers, but none of them are answering this existential, metaphysical, spiritual question. And he finally gets it answered by who? A music. The music talking about another music. And I hate that I might be saying the music word wrong. But the answer to the entire story, the entire struggle of Levin, is of course found by a music. It's not found by a nobleman. It's not found by a philosopher. It's not found by Hegel or whoever else he's reading, Schopenhauer, right? It's not found by this rationality, this reason. He comes to realize that there's something deeper, this belief, this faith that transcends reason. And the interesting thing is that there's this character in the film that is the opposite side of Levin. It's his brother, but I think it's actually his half-brother, Sergei Ivanovich, who's a professor, a writer, a philosopher, and who is always coming at him with this battleground, this philosophical, conversational battleground of reason, rationality. He's a scholar, and they are always at odds. They're always, butting heads. And Levin wants to kind of explain to him, especially at the end, this idea of soul. But he can't. He can't get through to his own brother, who they've been at odds this entire time. And I love this little story of the brother. He's staying at Levin's estate at the same time that Varenka, this is what I wanted to come back to with Varenka. Varenka comes back, visits Kitty when she gets married at Levin's estate, and they're all really enjoying themselves. Kitty tries to set up Varenka with Sergei Ivanovich, which is Levin's half-brother, I believe, who's the philosopher, the scholar, the writer. I think he's a professor. And they are in this beautiful moment in nature, looking at these mushrooms. They're alone, and they both sense that that he could, in this very moment, ask her to marry him. And Varenka is this beautiful, lovely, simple, servant-hearted Christian girl, and Sergei is almost the opposite. He's complex, he's full of rhetoric, he's full of ideas, he's full of reason, logic, scholasticism. And in this moment of truth where they both feel in their soul, beyond the rationality, that they want to be together, he crosses, his wires get crossed, and he changes his mind, and he brings up some trivial fact about the mushrooms. And he doesn't ask her to marry him. And he chooses kind of this reason over love, over the soul, over kind of that letting go and experiencing the truth of feeling and of relationship with the other. And it's so fascinating because at the very end, I'll read this. Levin comes to kind of this final conclusion. He's searched for meaning. He's gotten so desperate, so suicidal himself. Even after Anna has committed suicide, he is suicidal himself because he resolves himself not to go anywhere with a rope or with his rifle because he's afraid of committing suicide. And that is a direct allusion to how Tolstoy felt in his life. The same way. He wouldn't go anywhere with his rope and his rifle, I think, towards the end of his life because he was afraid of committing suicide, this concept of death. But this is the very last words of the novel, and it's fitting that it's Levin, right? It's his thoughts. And Tolstoy has a way of telling the story through the characters' thoughts, through what they're thinking in different interactions and different moments. And the story begins with Oblonsky, but it ends with Levin. And that's a unique concept as well that maybe I'll touch on after I read this. And we'll kind of bring this all to a close. Levin says, I'll get angry in the same way with the coachman Ivan, argue in the same way, speak my mind inappropriately. There will be the same wall between my soul's holy of holies and other people, even my wife. I'll accuse her in the same way of my own fear and then regret it. I'll fail in the same way to understand with my reason why I pray, and yet I will pray. But my life now, my whole life, regardless of all that may happen to me, every minute of it is not only not meaningless as it was before, but has the unquestionable meaning of the good, which it is in my power to put into it. The end. A classic tale of good and evil. Anna chooses evil, chooses self, and ends up dying at her own volition. Levin chooses family, chooses hard work, chooses meaning, chooses even serving his family and his community, and chooses to confront this pain, these questions within him. And from the simplest mind, the music, he finds the answer. And it doesn't necessarily change the fact that he might be rude, he might be terse, he might still be afraid, he might still be irritable. But his life is now imbued with this meaning that he can bring the good into the world. And so I think that's a pretty fitting way to end. I think overall, my thoughts to conclude are the juxtaposition, right? The juxtaposition between the two worlds, the city and the country. And that by the end, Oblonsky had become so essentially just full of struggle in his material life that Levin had to take care of Oblonsky's wife and their kids. They lived with Levin on their property. And even Kitty's and Dolly's parents lived with Levin. And Levin kind of becomes this, in a good way, this magnanimous character that I loved even in the introduction. That Levin, there are thousands of Levins in Russia, according to one of the authors that I've read in the introduction. And he represents kind of this, in many ways, hopefully this positive archetype. But I'll finish with something that was said in the very introduction, the very beginning, before the book even started, the translator's introduction, where he said that Anna and Levin were extremely different in many ways, but they shared one thing. And this is actually a really interesting little micro anecdote about them that happens within the film. The one thing that they shared, according to the translator, is a metaphysical solitude. Metaphysical solitude. And that is what they also shared with the author. And what a profound phrase, right? A metaphysical solitude. I think that metaphysical solitude is something that we all experience, at least personally, right? That inability to describe in words the ineffability of what's going on within you, within your soul, right? Within the thing that's bigger than the material. And even at the end, Kitty can tell that Levin has been assuaged of his suffering, that he's come to the reality of faith as she has many years before. But he doesn't even try to express it to her. It's this non-verbal knowing that they experience. And so this metaphysical solitude is something that we all experience, but it actually perhaps connects us to something that can understand us within our solitude. And I think that something is the divine. It's the being that created us, right? And we can substitute it. We can try to find it, as Anna did in love and romance, rather scandalously, or as Levin attempted to in achievement and ideas and revolutionary thinking. And we can find it in trying to use, maybe even as Oblonsky did, use our gifts, our talents, our natural kind of skills and abilities to garner attention. But at the end of the day, this metaphysical solitude, I think, is only quenched by the metaphysical essence itself. Which is according to, Tolstoy is God. And so, again, I was not ready for this. I was not ready for an extremely theological text in many ways. But I think in many ways it spoke to me very deeply. And I will finish with this. There was one moment in the story, only one scene, where Anna and Levin meet. The whole time, Tolstoy's painting their separate pictures. But in one moment, close to the end, they meet. And this is on the back of Kitty being in Moscow, Levin being in Moscow with their family, and Levin living the city life, which he is ill-fitted for. He's spending money that he doesn't have. Everything is more expensive. And he's doing all of these things that he would never do in the country. And they go to the club. And I love what Kitty's dad and Oblonsky's father-in-law calls the club. It's Levin, it's Vronsky, it's Levin's brother, Levin's father-in-law. And Levin's father-in-law says, "Welcome to our temple of idleness," because in it, all they do is eat, they smoke cigars, they have wine brought to them, they gamble, right? It's this temple of idleness that actually sucks all of the life out of the soul. It's the living for the belly, right? The material, where your gut is your God, right? And Levin gets swept up into this world. And even then, at the club, he's asked by Oblonsky, Anna's brother, to come visit Anna, who, as we've said, Anna couldn't really go out in society. She was essentially scorned, with the scarlet letter. But under the influence, literally, of alcohol, of the idleness, of the city, of wanting to fit in, Levin goes to visit Anna. And Tolstoy paints this incredible picture of Anna. It's dark. She's in a beautiful, house funded by Vronsky. There's some kind of lamps on, but it's like this kind of dark, deep furniture, multiple rooms, and she's alone. And she invites them in. She brings them in, and she charms Levin. Levin is on the back of being literally under the influence of alcohol and the city life and the idleness itself. And she invites them in, and she literally seduces Levin. She brings all of her charm and charisma to bear on Levin, and he ends up essentially in this moment falling for her, right? And she's doing this. It's literally an attempt in vanity. It's vain because she knows it's not for any good, but she's trying to prove again to herself that she can still get a man that is exceptional in many ways to like her, because now Vronsky has essentially decided he's not in love with her, but he's not really telling her. She's doing all this to prove to herself that she still is worthwhile in some ways, or still has that thing, that charm. And he in this moment essentially falls for her. And then he returns home, and Kitty realizes she can, as women can, she sniffs it out almost immediately and says, like, what's gotten into you? What happened? Where did you go? And he finally tells her, and he's blushing, and she can tell. And then she basically says, we're leaving, we're going back to the country. And it's this idea that the city life starves you of this actual meaning, this actual work, this actual family, this actual life of contribution rather than just consumption and idleness. And I think that's an invitation for all of us as well, right? That like Anna, or like these noblemen, these idle noblemen, when we pursue this life of comfort and caviar and balls and literally triviality, all of the conversations in the society, the high society, are completely trivial. It's gossip, it's, philosophical pondering that really has no bearing on reality itself. Sort of again exemplified by Levin's brother, Sergei Ivanovich, who, as we said, doesn't end up making the decision to marry Varenka, who is literally one of the purest and most beautiful characters in this entire book. And may we see this obviously as a cautionary tale, but as an encouragement to pursue meaning, to pursue work, to pursue family, to pursue the difficult questions within us, to pursue the things that make us extremely uncomfortable, but are good for us. And in so doing, we actually, just as Levin did, end up creating this covering, creating this wealth, creating this experience, this wisdom for those around us, right? And so that's really what I will say. I think there's so many other things, there's so many other, notes that I've had, but I think that I've, in my best way, summed it up and left us all with a challenge to pursue the Levin life, even though it's extremely painful and extremely bothersome and full of suffering at times. But in the end, it's the good, right? To pursue the good, to imbue the good into everything that we do, and to remember that there's more than reason, there's more than physicality, the materiality. There is the metaphysical, there is the divine, there is the very thing that the book started with. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. That there is this higher power that has an effect upon the world that we live in. And to let that effect be had beyond our own control. Thanks for listening to episode 1. Not yet sponsored by LaCroix, Pamplemousse flavor. Hopefully we'll have an episode 2 very soon. Cheers.